On the morning of March 17th, 1943, a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress lifted off from Recklinlerz airfield in northeastern Germany. The silver bomber climbed steadily into the pale sky, its four Wright Cyclone engines roaring with that distinctive deep thunder that American bomber crews knew so well. But this fortress was not flying toward England. It was not carrying a crew of 10 young Americans heading home after a mission. The aircraft bore German markings, black crosses on white squares painted on the fuselage and wings, a swastika on the tail fin. The test pilot at the controls was Luftwaffe officer, checking instruments, testing response, evaluating what the Americans had built. This was Wolfhound, serial number 41-24585, the first intact B-17 Flying Fortress captured by Nazi Germany. What German engineers discovered during their exhaustive testing of this aircraft and others like it would fundamentally change how the Luftwaffe fought the air war over Europe. They would learn that the Americans had not simply built another bomber. They had created a flying weapons platform so heavily armed, so thoroughly defended from every angle, that attacking it required courage that bordered on suicide. The B-17 did not just carry bombs. It carried 1350 caliber machine guns arranged in overlapping fields of fire that created what Luftwaffe pilots would come to call a death zone, a sphere of lethal firepower extending hundreds of yards in every direction, and the Germans were about to learn this lesson the hardest way possible. The story began 3 months earlier, on December 12th, 1942. The 303rd Bomb Group, Hell's Angels, was flying its 6th combat mission, a strike against railroad marshalling yards at Sotteville-les-Rouen in northern France. Lieutenant Paul F. Flickinger piloted Wolfhound as part of the formation. The mission proceeded according to plan until the bombers turned for home. Then German fighters attacked. Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagdgeschwader 2 swept in from multiple angles. 20mm cannon shells punched through aluminum skin. Hydraulic lines severed, control surfaces shredded, an engine caught fire. Flickinger fought the controls as the fortress lost altitude and fell behind the formation. Once a bomber left the protective formation, it became a solitary target. The concentrated defensive fire that made B-17 formations so dangerous disappeared. German fighters swarmed the crippled aircraft. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Flickinger had no choice. With one engine dead, another sputtering, hydraulics failing, and German fighters still attacking, he aimed for a field near Melun, about 60 miles southeast of Paris. The B-17 came down hard in a controlled crash landing, belly first into winter wheat. The ball, turret guns, pointing downward, ploughing a long furrow through frozen ground. The fortress slid to a stop in a cloud of dirt and torn metal. Miraculously, the crew survived. 8 men were captured immediately. But Lieutenants Gilbert Showalter and Jack Williams, along with Sergeants Norman Therion, Frederick Hartung, Ivor Lee Forget, and William Whitman, managed to escape in the confusion. They would spend months evading capture, hiding in barns, moving at night, relying on French civilians who risked their lives to help Allied airmen reach Spain or England. But the fortress stayed behind. German salvage specialists arrived within hours. What they found was extraordinary. Despite the crash landing, despite the battle damage, the B-17 was largely intact. The airframe was bent but not broken. The engines were damaged but repairable. Most importantly, the defensive armament was still in place. Guns in the nose, in the top turret, in the waist positions, in the tail. This was the first opportunity Luftwaffe engineers would have to examine a flying fortress up close in detail. Until this moment, their knowledge of the B-17 came from intelligence reports, from brief combat encounters, from examining scattered wreckage of aircraft shot down over Germany. Those sources provided fragments of information. Wolfhound would provide answers. German ground crews transported the damaged bomber to Leeuwarden Airfield in the Netherlands. For weeks, technicians worked on the aircraft. They replaced damaged control surfaces. They repaired hydraulic lines. They rebuilt 2 engines using parts cannibalized from other crashed B-17s. The ball turret was too damaged to repair, but everything else was gradually restored to flying condition. In February 1943, the Fortress was painted in Luftwaffe colors and marked with the identification code DL+XC. Then it was flown to Recklinghausen, the Luftwaffe's primary test and evaluation center located in Mecklenburg. Rechlin was where Germany tested everything, captured Allied aircraft, prototype German designs, experimental weapons systems. The facility had extensive workshops, multiple runways, and some of the most experienced test pilots in the Luftwaffe. Engineers at Rechlin had examined crashed B-17s before. In October 1942, they had reassembled a wrecked Fortress that had been shot down after drifting from formation. Senior Luftwaffe leadership had inspected that wreckage. The comments they made revealed how seriously they took the American bomber threat. Colonel Adolf Galland, chief of day fighter squadrons and soon to become general of fighter aircraft, examined the wreckage carefully. His assessment was blunt and professional. The B-17, he said, united every possible advantage in one bomber: heavy armor, enormous altitude capability, colossal defensive armament, and great speed. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, State Secretary for the Luftwaffe and second in command of the entire air force, was even more pessimistic. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had assured Milch there was no cause for anxiety about American bombers. Milch disagreed. He told colleagues he could not get over his worries. Germany would have to accept that enemy bombers would eventually be attacking at 28,000 or 30,000 feet with firepower and numbers that would overwhelm German defenses. Milch called 1943 the year of clenched teeth. It would prove to be an understatement. But examining wreckage was not the same as flying the aircraft. Wolfhound gave German test pilots the opportunity to experience the B-17 from the inside, to understand how it handled, to evaluate its strengths and identify its weaknesses. The first test flight took place on March 17th. The Luftwaffe pilot selected for the evaluation was experienced with large aircraft, but nothing had prepared him for what the Americans had built. The B-17F model weighed approximately 32,000 pounds empty and over 65,000 pounds fully loaded with fuel, bombs, and crew. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, drove 3-bladed propellers nearly 12 feet in diameter. The aircraft could cruise at over 180 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, could reach a maximum speed of 290 miles per hour in level flight, and had a service ceiling above 35,000 feet. The bomb bay could carry up to 8,000 pounds of ordnance on short-range missions, though typical combat loads were between 4,000 and 6,000 pounds to extend range. But what impressed the German test pilot most was not the performance specifications. It was the layout, the sheer size of the interior, the complexity of systems that American crews operated as routine. The flight deck sat high in the aircraft, providing excellent visibility. Instruments were clearly marked in English, controls were well positioned. The cockpit felt spacious compared to German bombers. Behind the pilots sat the flight engineer and top turret gunner, positioned where he could monitor engine performance and immediately engage targets from above. Moving aft through the aircraft required squeezing past the bomb bay, a narrow, dangerous passage when bombs were loaded, but manageable in an empty test aircraft. Beyond the bomb bay was the radio operator's station with another defensive gun position. Further aft was the ball turret mounting point, though Wolfhound's damaged turret had never been replaced. Past the ball turret were the waist gun positions where 2 gunners stood at open windows, each manning a .50 caliber Browning. At the very tail of the aircraft, isolated from the rest of the crew, sat the tail gunner with twin 50s protecting the rear quarter. The German pilot flew the B-17 through basic maneuvers. The Fortress was not agile. It did not turn sharply or climb steeply like a fighter. But it was stable, responsive for its size, and remarkably forgiving. The controls required physical strength to move, but responded predictably. The aircraft felt solid, engineered for reliability rather than performance. It was designed to fly straight and level through flak, through fighter attacks, through weather that would ground smaller aircraft and deliver its bombs on target before turning for home. Over the next weeks, Wolfhound flew multiple test missions from Rechlin. German engineers documented every system. They measured fuel consumption, tested engine performance at various altitudes, evaluated how the aircraft handled at different weights and center of gravity positions. They fired the defensive guns to understand fields of fire and assess ammunition capacity. They studied the Norden bomb sight, considered by Americans to be a top-secret precision bombing device. But what German engineers documented most carefully was the defensive armament. The early B-17F models, like Wolfhound, carried 9 to 11 50 caliber machine guns, depending on field modifications. By the time the definitive B-17G model entered service in summer 1943, that number had increased to 13. The Americans had taken the AN/M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun, essentially an aircraft version of the famous Mardeus heavy machine gun, and mounted it everywhere. The gun weighed 61 pounds, measured 57 inches long, and fired 750 rounds per minute at a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second. Effective range was approximately 3,500 feet. Each gun fired 50 caliber ammunition, cartridges 5.5 inches long, weighing nearly 2 ounces each. The ammunition came in several types, marked by painted tips. Red meant tracer rounds that left a visible trail, allowing gunners to observe their fire. Blue meant incendiary rounds, designed to ignite fuel. Silver meant armor-piercing incendiary that could penetrate thin armor plating and then ignite. Black meant standard armor-piercing. American bombers typically loaded mixed belts combining all types. The B-17G defensive positions were arranged to create overlapping fields of fire covering every angle of approach. Starting at the nose, the Bombardier operated a remote-controlled chin turret mounting 250s with 1,460 rounds total. This turret was specifically designed to counter head-on attacks, the tactic German fighters had developed as the most effective way to engage bomber formations. On each side of the nose were single, cheek-mounted guns covering beam approaches. Inside the nose, both the Bombardier and Navigator had access to flexible mounted 50s. Above and behind the cockpit sat the top turret with 250s and 800 rounds. This position could traverse 360 degrees and elevate to cover attacks from above and slightly ahead. The top turret gunner was typically the flight engineer who could simultaneously monitor engine instruments while maintaining defensive vigilance. In the radio compartment, amidships, was another flexible 50 with 200 rounds covering the upper rear quadrant. This gun could engage fighters attacking from above and behind, supplementing the top turret's coverage. Below the aircraft, the Sperry Ball turret housed 2 more 50s with 1,000 rounds total. This spherical turret could rotate completely around both horizontal and vertical axes, providing full coverage of the lower hemisphere. The Ball turret gunner occupied perhaps the most uncomfortable and dangerous position in the aircraft, cramped into a space barely 4 feet in diameter, knees bent, unable to wear a parachute, completely exposed in a plexiglass bubble beneath the bomber's belly. The waist positions on each side of the rear fuselage mounted single 50s with 1,200 rounds each, the largest ammunition allocation for any gun position. Waist gunners stood at open windows in the unpressurized fuselage, exposed to temperatures that dropped to 42 degrees below zero. At operating altitude, they wore heated suits, oxygen masks, heavy gloves, and multiple layers of clothing. The guns themselves had electric heaters to prevent the mechanisms from freezing. Finally, at the extreme tail, sat the tail gunner with twin 50s and 565 rounds per gun, 1,130 rounds total. This position was physically separated from the rest of the crew. The tail gunner sat alone, facing backward, watching enemy fighters make their attacks. He could not easily communicate with the rest of the crew, could not see what was happening ahead, relied entirely on his pilot's ability to keep the bomber flying while he defended against attacks from behind. In total, a fully armed B-17G carried approximately 7,500 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition weighing over 1,100 pounds. When all 13 guns fired simultaneously, they could put approximately 97 rounds per second into a target zone. A 3-second burst, typical for engaging a fast-moving fighter, would release nearly 300 rounds. A 5-second burst would release almost 500 rounds. The combined weight of fire was devastating. German engineers calculated the ballistics carefully. A 50 caliber bullet left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. At 1,000 yards range, it was still traveling over 2,000 feet per second. The bullet carried enormous kinetic energy, over 13,000 foot-pounds at the muzzle. A single hit could tear through the thin aluminum skin of a German fighter. 2 or 3 hits could sever control cables, rupture fuel lines, or damage engines. A sustained burst could disintegrate an aircraft. More importantly, the German engineers recognized something that made the B-17 uniquely dangerous. The key defensive positions were arranged so that overlapping fields of fire covered every approach angle. A fighter attacking from 12 o'clock high, straight ahead and slightly above, faced fire from the chin turret, both cheek guns, the top turret, and potentially the nose guns. That was 6 to 8 machine guns. A fighter attacking from 6 o'clock level, straight behind, faced the tail guns, both waist guns, potentially the ball turret, and the radio compartment gun. Again, 5 to 7 machine guns. There was no safe approach angle. Every attack put the fighter in the crosshairs of multiple gun positions. Even if a German pilot successfully evaded fire from one position, other guns would track him through their overlapping zones. The B-17 had created what modern military analysts would call a 360-degree defensive envelope. The Americans had built a bomber that could shoot in every direction simultaneously. But the true danger became clear when German engineers considered not a single B-17, but a formation. American bombers did not fly alone. They flew in combat boxes, tightly coordinated formations designed to maximize defensive firepower. A typical squadron box consisted of 9 to 12 aircraft. 3 squadron boxes, stacked vertically and horizontally, formed a group of 36 aircraft. 3 groups, flying in trail, formed a combat wing of over 100 aircraft. Each B-17 in the formation brought 13 machine guns. A 12-aircraft squadron box brought 156 guns to bear. A 36-aircraft group brought 468 guns. A full combat wing of over 100 bombers could field more than 1,300 heavy machine guns. The formation was designed so that the guns of multiple aircraft covered the same airspace. When German fighters attacked, they faced not just the guns of their target aircraft, but guns from every bomber in the formation that had line of sight. Luftwaffe pilots who had fought B-17 formations compared the experience to attacking a porcupine covered in fire. The defensive fire did not just come from the bomber you targeted. It came from every direction, from aircraft you were not even aiming at, from positions you could not see until tracers started flying past your cockpit. The fire was not accurate. Bomber gunners were not precision marksmen hitting specific targets. But accuracy did not matter when hundreds of guns were firing hundreds of rounds, creating a wall of lead that filled the sky. German fighter pilots who survived multiple encounters with B-17 formations developed a healthy respect that bordered on fear. One Luftwaffe pilot described the approach to a formation. He could see the bombers ahead, silver shapes against the sky, sunlight glinting off plexiglass and aluminum. They looked slow, vulnerable, like targets. But as his fighter closed to within 2,000 meters, he began seeing small flashes from the bomber formation, muzzle flashes from guns opening fire. Then the tracers appeared, red streaks arcing through the air. At first just a few, then dozens, then what seemed like hundreds. The tracers swarmed like wasps, one pilot said. His cockpit was surrounded by red streaks long before he could open fire effectively. And because of the low closing speed from a stern attack, this extremely uncomfortable situation could continue for several minutes. Some pilots broke away prematurely. The rest passed through the formation at whatever angle promised the best chance of survival. It was nothing like attacking Soviet bombers on the Eastern Front or British bombers at night. This concentrated defensive fire like nothing the Luftwaffe had ever encountered. Attacking from behind meant flying through this wall of fire for a long, terrifying time while the bombers shot at you, but you could not yet return effective fire. Fighter cannon had maximum effective range of about 400 meters. Machine guns were effective to perhaps 600 meters, but bomber defensive guns opened fire at 1,000 meters or more. German pilots had to endure that incoming fire, watching tracers flash past, hearing bullets punch through their aircraft, hoping nothing critical got hit before they closed to firing range. And when they finally did reach firing range and opened fire, they had perhaps 2 or 3 seconds to aim, shoot, and break away before they either collided with the bomber or passed through the formation into the guns of other bombers behind the target. After examining wrecked B-17s and analyzing combat camera footage from fighter aircraft, Luftwaffe intelligence calculated it took approximately 20 hits with 20mm cannon shells fired from behind to bring down a flying fortress. The bombers were heavily built, with armor plate protecting critical systems and crew positions, self-sealing fuel tanks that resisted fire even when punctured, and redundant control systems that kept the aircraft flying even after sustaining damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. Intelligence officers studied firing accuracy by reviewing hundreds of hours of gun camera film from German fighters. They found that pilots of average ability hit bombers with only about 2% of rounds fired. 2%. To achieve 20 hits, the average German pilot needed to fire 1,020mm rounds at a bomber. The Focke-Wulf 190, Germany's best fighter, carried 500 rounds for its 20mm cannon. Even expert pilots, the aces with dozens of kills, struggled to get enough rounds on target in the brief firing window available during a stern attack. Major Anton Haeckel, who would end the war with 192 confirmed victories, explained the problem clearly. When attacking from the rear, there was a long closing period from 1,000 meters to 400 meters, during which the bombers were firing at German fighters, but the fighters could not yet return fire effectively. The bombers' 50 caliber guns outranged German fighter weapons. The fighters had to absorb defensive fire. They could not answer. Wolfhound visited Luftwaffe fighter units throughout Germany and France during spring and summer 1943. The captured fortress was flown to operational airfields where German pilots could examine it closely, could sit in the crew positions, could understand what American gunners saw when German fighters attacked. The visits served as training, helping pilots recognize the bomber's vulnerable points and understand its defensive capabilities. The demonstrations emphasized a critical tactical lesson. Attacking from behind was nearly suicidal unless executed perfectly by expert pilots. The solution emerged during late autumn 1942. Oberleutnant Egon Meyer, serving as Staffelkapitän of 7/JG2, had been studying combat reports from pilots who engaged American bombers. Meyer was analytical, methodical, the kind of officer who examined data rather than relying on instinct. He compared attack tactics, gunnery techniques, formation flying. He visited crash sites to inspect downed B-17s personally, walking around the wreckage, studying gun positions, measuring angles of fire. From those inspections, Meyer realized something that would change how the Luftwaffe fought heavy bombers. The B-17F had relatively weak forward-facing armament. Most models had only a single 30 caliber machine gun in the nose, a light weapon largely ineffective against high-speed fighters. Some models had flexible mounted 50 calibers that the bombardier or navigator could fire through nose windows, but those guns were difficult to aim and had limited traverse. The nose was the weak point. More importantly, Meyer believed that a high-speed fighter approaching head-on would be almost impossible for tail and waist gunners to track. The closing speed would be too high. By the time gunners reacted and swung their weapons around, the fighter would already be past, and gunners would be reluctant to fire at fighters approaching from ahead because they risked hitting their own aircraft in formation. The head-on attack solved multiple problems simultaneously. The test came on November 23, 1942. 36 B-17s attacked the U-boat pens at Saint-Nazaire on the French Atlantic coast. The bombers flew without fighter escort, too far from England for Spitfires or P-47s to accompany them. Mayer led Focke-Wulf 190s from his grouper to intercept. The German fighters formed into Ketten, 3 aircraft elements, and swept in to meet the bombers head-on. The attack worked exactly as Mayer had theorized. The fighters approached from ahead and slightly to one side at a combined closing speed exceeding 500 miles per hour. American gunners saw the fighters coming but had only seconds to react. The nose guns opened fire but scored few hits against such fast-moving targets. Then the German fighters were there, cannons blazing and gone again in seconds, breaking away before the tail and waist guns could track them effectively. The headquarters of the 8th Air Force noted after the mission that a change in enemy fighter tactics had been observed. Nearly all attacks were frontal, apparently aimed at the right side of the nose. One historian later recorded that from that moment, the B-17 was obsolete as a self-defending bomber. Mayer's tactic demonstrated that an initial head-on attack could break up a formation, killing pilots and bombardiers, shattering plexiglass noses, destroying engines. After the formation scattered, other fighters could concentrate on isolated bombers whose defensive firepower had been weakened. General Major Adolf Galland circulated new tactical regulations to all Luftwaffe fighter units. The orders listed 5 object lessons. First, attacking from the rear against a 4-engine bomber formation promised little success and almost always brought losses. Second, the head-on attack, while demanding great skill and courage, offered the highest probability of killing the crew and destroying vital systems. Third, fighters should attack in coordinated formations, never singly. Fourth, attacks should be pressed home to very close range before breaking away. Fifth, fighters should never remain in the defensive fire envelope longer than absolutely necessary. The head-on attack became the preferred method for engaging American heavy bombers. It required extraordinary skill. The fighter pilot had perhaps 2 seconds of firing time as the aircraft converged at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Aim had to be perfect. The pilot had to fire, observe results, and break away immediately before colliding with the bomber or flying into the defensive fire of other aircraft in the formation. German fighter pilots joked grimly that it took nerves of steel and perhaps a small amount of insanity, but even with the head-on tactic, B-17 formations remained extraordinarily dangerous. The Americans responded to German frontal attacks by adding more forward-facing guns. The B-17G, which entered service in summer 1943, featured a remote-controlled chin turret mounting 250s directly below the bombardier's position. Single-gun cheek blisters were added on each side of the nose. Combined with the top turret, the additional nose guns gave the B-17 much stronger defense against frontal attacks. The move and counter-move continued. Luftwaffe fighters responded by increasing their armament. Some Focke-Wulf 190s were equipped with 4 or even 6 20mm cannon plus twin 13mm machine guns. Heavy bomber-destroyer variants mounted even larger weapons, 37mm, 50mm, even 75mm cannon designed to destroy bombers with a single hit from outside the range of defensive guns. Some fighters carried air-to-air rockets that could be launched from a distance, but these heavy weapons reduced fighter performance, making them vulnerable to American escort fighters. And that was the final piece of the equation. German fighters had developed effective tactics against B-17 formations. The head-on attack worked. Bomber-destroyer aircraft with heavy cannon worked. But starting in early 1944, American long-range fighters began escorting bomber formations deep into Germany. P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks could accompany bombers all the way to targets inside Germany and back. Luftwaffe fighters now faced a choice: ignore the escorts and attack the bombers while American fighters shot them down, or fight the escorts and let the bombers through. The B-17's defensive armament had bought time for American planners to develop fighter escorts capable of protecting bomber formations throughout their missions. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe losses among experienced fighter pilots had become catastrophic. The replacements, arriving at frontline units, were barely trained, flying against American pilots with months of experience and aircraft that matched or exceeded German fighter performance. Wolfhound continued flying for the Luftwaffe throughout 1943 and into 1944. After testing at Rechlin, the fortress was transferred to Kampfgeschwader 200, the special operations unit that flew captured Allied aircraft on clandestine missions. The B-17 was recoded A3+AE and based at Finsterwald Airfield. German pilots flew the fortress on long-range missions across Europe, reconnaissance flights, supply drops to German forces operating behind Soviet lines, and transportation of important personnel. The B-17's range and reliability made it ideal for missions German aircraft could not accomplish, but Wolfhound's operational career eventually ended. On April 6, 1945, with Germany collapsing and Allied armies advancing from all directions, the fortress was caught in an American air raid. The aircraft was destroyed on the ground at Oranienburg Airfield, consumed by the same kind of bombs it had once carried over occupied Europe. By then, Kampfgeschwader had operated approximately 40 captured B-17s and B-24s at various times, using them for missions that German aircraft could not perform. Most of those captured bombers were destroyed in the final months of the war, bombed on their airfields, cannibalized for parts, or deliberately destroyed by retreating German forces to prevent capture. The B-17 Flying Fortress was produced in greater numbers than any other American heavy bomber. From 1936 through 1945, more than 12,700 were built. They flew over 600,000 combat sorties during the war. 4,735 were lost in combat, 1 in every 3 built. Those statistics represent tens of thousands of American airmen who climbed into flying fortresses knowing that, statistically, they had a poor chance of completing a 25-mission tour. Many did not survive their first 5 missions. The 8th Air Force, which operated the majority of B-17s in Europe, suffered the highest casualties of any American command in World War II. 26,000 airmen were killed in action. Another 28,000 became prisoners of war. The casualty rate was higher than the Marine Corps, higher than infantry divisions, higher than naval personnel. Flying into Germany aboard a B-17 was one of the most dangerous jobs in the American military. Bomber gunners achieved considerable success despite the difficulties of their position. The 8th Air Force claimed over 6,200 enemy aircraft destroyed by bomber gunners, more than credited to fighter pilots. Verifying these claims was extremely difficult. In the chaos of combat, multiple gunners often fired at the same target. Observation of confirmed crashes was rare. Gun camera footage did not exist for flexible defensive guns. Enlisted gunners received limited recognition compared to officer pilots. Even gunner aces who achieved 5 or more confirmed kills were often omitted from official ace lists. But the statistics, however uncertain, reflect a truth that German fighter pilots learned firsthand. The B-17's defensive armament was lethal. Attacking a bomber formation meant flying into concentrated fire from hundreds of guns. Even with superior tactics, even with heavy cannon, even with extraordinary courage, Luftwaffe fighters took terrible casualties. Many of Germany's most experienced fighter pilots died attacking American bomber formations. The combat box formation proved remarkably effective at maximizing defensive firepower. By flying in tight coordination with overlapping fields of fire, B-17 formations created defensive zones that were extraordinarily difficult to penetrate. German pilots compared bomber formations to fortified positions in the sky. You could attack them, could damage them, could sometimes break them up, but you paid a price in blood for every bomber you brought down. The lesson German engineers learned from testing captured B-17s was ultimately a lesson in industrial warfare. The Americans had not built the fastest bomber or the most heavily armored bomber. They had built a bomber that could be mass-produced by the thousands, could absorb tremendous battle damage and continue flying, and carried enough defensive armament to make attacking it dangerous even for expert pilots. The B-17 represented American industrial capacity translated into aerial warfare, overwhelming numbers, reliability, defensive firepower, and the willingness to accept heavy losses in pursuit of strategic objectives. When Field Marshal Erhard Milch examined that first wrecked B-17 in October 1942, his prediction about 1943 being the year of E, clenched teeth came from understanding what the fortress represented. It was not just one bomber, it was the visible symbol of American industrial power about to be deployed against Germany. Milch knew that American factories could produce B-17s faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. He knew that American training programs would replace lost aircrews faster than Germany could kill them. He saw the strategic reality that others refused to acknowledge. Adolf Galland's assessment was equally prophetic. The B-17 united every advantage: heavy armor, high altitude, colossal defensive armament, great speed. Those advantages, combined with American production capacity and determination, meant that Germany would face an aerial bombardment campaign unlike anything in military history. The strategic bombing offensive that unfolded through 1943, 1944, and into 1945 validated everything Milch and Galland had warned about. German cities burned, industrial production was disrupted, transportation networks were destroyed, civilian populations endured years of bombing. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had against the American bomber formations: expert pilots, heavy weapons, innovative tactics, desperation. None of it was enough. The mathematics were inexorable. American production exceeded German losses by such wide margins that the outcome was never in doubt. The only questions were how long the campaign would last and how many men would die on both sides. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.